Jeff and the golf performance coaches team have been working together for nearly a decade now, and Jeff himself, who we'll speak about here shortly, has years and years of experience, almost 20 years now of experience. I'm sure he's blushing as I remind him of his age, but he does a fantastic job at equipping junior-aged players. And so we thought, what better way to equip our parents with information that is extremely relevant in these formative years of a young athlete. So we're picturing a young man or woman, age 12, let's say, and we're trying to imagine what are the next 6, 7 years going to look like. And for some of you who are 15 years old, we're kind of a shorter window there of 3 or 4 years and so on. But at the end of the day, we feel that this presentation will be extremely valuable as we uncover and perhaps dismiss some of the myths of club fitting and club repair. And more importantly, we will try to make the case that just like any of the skills that we like to study, club fitting and club equipment are central to the optimization of performance for a junior-aged golfer. My name is John Roy. I'll be sort of guiding the presentation tonight. But to be honest, I will do very little talking except for at the start. I'm hoping that we'll be able to listen instead to the wisdom of Jeff Shuster, who, again, has seen it all and will speak very eloquently on the topics you see before you on the screen. The opening topic will be on the rules of golf. I would love to speak. Part of my hobby horse as a coach is to speak about the rules, and so I thought I would represent rule number 4, and that is the rule that deals with golf clubs. And I will explain a little bit about the ins and outs of that. That should take only a few moments. Then I'd like to introduce you formally to Mr. Jeff Shuster, who has joined us on tonight's webinar and will act the role of the expert. We will talk at length over the next, let's say, half hour before we open it up for questions. We would like to talk about topics like budgeting. So what kind of expenses are we looking at over the years of a junior age player as they optimize their equipment? And we'll talk about when you should properly fit, what time of year, what years, and so on. We'll divide the bag up into different categories and talk firstly about irons and hybrids. Then we'll talk about some woods and drivers, and then we'll talk about wedges and putters. And lastly, I thought there was a little bit of space that we could speak to how to properly maintain your bag or maintain your equipment. As is usual from week to week, I will be asking questions of the expert, and these questions have been drawn from a lot of the questions we've seen from parents over the years. But at the end of the presentation, we will open up the floor to anyone who'd like to stick around and kind of ask questions of Jeff or myself. And we, of course, welcome those as much as possible. And as is our habit, we will be recording tonight's presentation, and we'll be playing it in the future. So the case that I would like to make, there's a very interesting book, and I think I saw that Glenn was on the call today. So a very interesting man by the name of Frank Thomas surprised us at one of the seminars that Glenn put on for us years ago. And he had worked with the USGA, this testing center that you see on the photograph here. The USGA testing center is in New York State, and basically this is the hub of all of the equipment testing and ball testing that happens in the game of golf. And Frank Thomas, who wrote a book called From Sticks to Stones, very eloquently described the history of the game of golf as essentially being the balance between the rules of golf and technological innovation. And basically, and I've put in yellow the key to the quote down below, but basically the USGA, if you go to the USGA site, which is what I did, and you cut out the first sentence that they put on, it suggests the USGA continually tests golf equipment for conformance to the rules. Without such rigorous equipment testing and research programs, and this is the important part, advances in technology could soon overtake skill as the major factor in success. And as in Frank Thomas's book, which I highly recommend, or when you talk to purists like perhaps myself as a coach and so on, there is almost a fear that advances in technology could overtake skill as being the major factor in success. And actually, very topically, you could argue that a long putter would fit right into this sentence, and the reason that they would ban it would be that the argument would be that the long putter evades the need for skill, and ultimately the game of golf is hopefully held up as a skill-based endeavor. Interestingly, though, of course, and as a performance coach myself, we cannot overlook the importance of having optimized equipment. So it may not be that we can use the Rodney Dangerfield laser drivers, and that the USGA is very careful about. Having said that, it is obviously of utmost importance for the players who are trying to perform at their highest, perform as close to their potential as possible, that their equipment would be optimized. No one would argue that. Rule 4 in the rules book, and obviously, as I mentioned, I am a bit of a rules geek, and so I dutifully wrote down all of the key rules that we need to remember, and 4-1A suggests that a player's clubs must conform with the rules. 4-1B, a club is deemed to conform after wear through normal use, and any club that is altered is considered new and must conform, and so on and so forth. But to be honest, as I was doing this, I realized anyone can open up the rules book and figure out for themselves the intricacies of the club rule. What I would like to point out, though, are the keys to it. Number one, and this is something I always bring up when we work with volatile teenage athletes, I'll point out to this one, 4-3A. And the rules of golf, by the way, have about 32 rules in them. There's 28 that are relevant, and then there's 4 at the end to make the 32 that are. But in those 28 key rules, one of them is reserved for golf clubs. And in Rule 4-3A, they suggest that during a stipulated round, if a player's club is damaged in the normal course of play, then they can either A, use the club in its damaged state, or repair it or have it repaired, or replace it with another club. One of the keys here, though, to my point about the volatile teenage athlete, in the normal course of play is the critical variable. This means that banging it off of your bag stand, or banging it off your shoe, or banging it off your opponent would not qualify as normal course of play. And in those cases, of course, it's tough luck. Rule 4-3B, if a player's club is damaged not in the normal course of play, then tough luck. The last piece I'll say before we introduce Jeff is that the most important piece that any young player and their parents need to know: you may carry no more than 14 clubs in your golf bag. That's sort of a critical, classic rule. It wasn't always this way. There was a famous player who kind of created this rule, who used to carry about 38 clubs, varied between 35 and 40, depending what course he was playing, and God bless his caddy. But eventually they had to make a rule to sort of limit it, and they picked 14 clubs. Why? Well, who knows why? And I'm sure Jeff in some days would argue that there should be 15 or 16. But at the end of the day, the rules of golf state that a player has a maximum of 14 clubs in their bag. The penalty for this is quite severe. You are penalized 2 strokes on any hole where you have more than 14 clubs. So if by accident you have your club in your bag, or your dad's wedge, or what have you, upon discovery of this, you'll get 2 strokes for every hole, to a maximum of 4 strokes for the day, every hole that you have more than 14 clubs. So that's a critical one. Don't let your kids convince you that they need more than 14 clubs. Actually, I should stop myself there. The reality is, depending on the golf courses you play, most high-level players will have about 20 clubs, of which they're mixing and matching their optimum 14 for any given day. You're playing a shorter course, you may bring a few more wedges and the longer irons for the tee shots, and you may leave the 5-wood out. Then you go play a longer course, and you may add a 5-wood and a 7-wood to the bag, and then you'll have to sacrifice a wedge or maybe one of the long irons, and so forth. So you're kind of mixing and matching to these 14 clubs. But when you start, the first thing that any player does on the first tee, count your clubs before you tee off. Make sure you don't have more than 14. But without further ado, I would like to introduce the expert for the evening. Mr. Jeff Shuster has, as I mentioned earlier, almost 2 decades of experience building and fitting and repairing and talking about golf clubs. And he uses state-of-the-art technology and optimizes the very best equipment possibilities for his athletes.
Yeah, I think that was a great intro. I think you covered most of what we do, what I do. Lots of great points, and we're going to go through a few more slides about a few specifics, and again, what I bring to your program and your kids, and how I help along the journey with you guys.
Thanks for that, Jeff. If you don't mind, Jeff, when talking with the parents in preparation for this webinar, many of them were describing what it's like over a 5-year span, let's say from the ages of 13 to 18, as a young player kind of develops in their formative years. Could you do us the favor of enlightening us as to what happens over this critical age period from 13 to 18. I mean, as parents, we know at home that things are changing a lot in this period, but I'm wondering what the implications are to a golfer. So what kind of club fitting angles need we be aware of in the ages of 13 to 18 years?
Yeah, so there's definitely in that um, more so the early stages, the 12 or 13-year-old, as you may have found when you go into your typical golf store, there is no, let's assume that they're currently using like a US kids product, great product for kids, but now at 12, 13 years old, your junior is no longer a kid. They are not a lady. They are not a man when it comes to looking at golf equipment off a rack in a golf store. So those are really the sort of critical years we have to custom build something for that kid that is, excuse me, that is out of the USGA, sorry, the US Kids golf clubs. And what we generally do is we'll generally, if you will, start them on that journey. These are kids that have sort of committed to playing this game seriously, working with coaches, getting some training. So we know that they're going to be playing at a competitive level and taking the game very seriously. So what we generally will do is start with an adult component, if you will, as far as the heads are concerned, but we will build them using either a junior shaft or an appropriate men's senior or whatever the flex may be, and build them to the stature and proper flex to the junior, which will then likely be rebuilt at least once. If this is not your first 12 or 13 year, you'll know a little better how they can grow in leaps and bounds in a 6 month period. So when they do grow out of that set, which could be within a year or the following year, you still have quality heads that we can then pull apart and rebuild for that next stage. So that's really what we do is what I'm here to do is I stress to people, I'm not here to sell you golf equipment. I'm here to help you play the game better, and that obviously entails purchasing golf equipment. So we want to help you make that proper purchase that is going to help your kid along their journey, and certainly not sort of negate the whole coaching process if, as John mentioned earlier, if the equipment is not optimized to help the player or the kid in this place best perform to their potential.
Well, thanks for that, Jeff. And before we move on to the next question, I thought it would be a good time to describe one of the great synergies that I get repeatedly from our experiences working with you. And obviously, as coaches, it's critical that we surround ourselves with experts in various fields. But in no case is this more glaring than in the equipment. I mean, at the end of the day, these are young, developing players who, when armed with the proper sets of equipment, can do fantastic things and can develop at a very predictable and consistent rate. Contrast that with the opposite effect, which is to say when misfit for equipment, when they borrow their dad's old clubs, or they've got clubs that are too short, or so on and so forth, we really see a stunting of the growth and the development curve, which is just... And so it's so critical to, let's just imagine the analogy that these were young runners that we were developing here. It's so critical to get the right size shoe for a junior aged player so that we avoid the blisters and we continue that, and so that they continue to love running. It's not unlike this analogy at all when we put the golf clubs in their hands. It's just an easier game, and an otherwise difficult sport becomes easier when the equipment fits well. And just in terms of simple motivational factors for young players developing, this can be absolutely critical. So certainly the synergy between the coach and the fitter is relevant, and something that I see consistently as we've developed this relationship over the years. But the question that comes up all the time, Jeff, when is the best time to get fit for golf clubs?
Right off the bat, really. If you're committing to play this game, which is especially in the GTA, is an expensive commitment on many levels. Um, the upfront cost of the equipment, which is, I would say a one-time expenditure. Is not exactly one time, but over the course of 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, however long the equipment is going to last the player, it's really the running, the running or the shoes when it comes to kids. We all have kids. We know that, it's a fine line between giving the kids some hand-me-downs, if you will, that are a little big and they're going to grow into, but it's going to impede them in the immediate. And if we're looking to improve and grow at the immediate, it's not a great idea. So that's really what we do is not so much sell you equipment, but make sure that you have the right equipment. And we always do our best to make sure that it's going to last as long as possible. But as I say to people, it's impossible to say the child is going to grow this much this quickly and make those guesses. We just don't know. But it is very important if you're going down this journey and investing in the coaching and the golf membership. It's kind of, in my mind, silly not to get the proper equipment. And in most cases, we've done the hockey with the kids or whatever other sport there may be. Hockey's another good example that when you go into the store and you buy a hockey stick, whether it's Jeff Shuster or John Roy, who we all play hockey, we don't just take that stick and take it right to the ice. We still cut it down, we still tape it, we still customize it to some degree. And with golf equipment, particularly for juniors, it's integral that it is properly fitted, or they're just going to go and possibly give up on the game because they're not progressing and they're not seeing the enjoyment of the game. So that's it's very important to make sure that it's sized and we leave that little bit of growing room for them, but not to the point where it's going to impede them. And you don't want to be making drastic changes mid-season, during the tournament season. So what we found over the years is that most of the manufacturers are now releasing their new product around November for the following year. It's kind of like what they do with the so your 2017 product is going to launch for the most part in November. So where I am busiest with competitive golfers, whether it's competitive or serious golfers, both of those two categories are generally playing golf year round, even though our season will end, September or October, whatever the case may be. These are still, with regards to the GPC, you're still working year round. You may have that 1 month or 2 months where you sort of put it down to rest, but you want to make equipment changes in the off season, get it in your hands, get in some recreational rounds, whether it's a trip over Christmas with the family or the March break camps where you're not competing, but you want to have that new equipment in your hands, practicing with it at the domes or simulators or wherever you practice, and make sure that there aren't some tweaks that need to be made. This is not a one and done process. This is most important that I stress with all of my clients, but particularly with Jeff and John, the GPC, is you're not getting it and it's done and you hope that everything's great. Most of the time, I would say well over 90% of the time, things are pretty good the first time. But there may be a case where we need to make some tweaks, particularly these kids are being coached, and whether it's from a swing perspective, things are constantly changing as they improve. So I'm constantly there supporting um, John and Jim's program and available for any question follow-up. So as soon as the new equipment is released and you know that the individual is in the market for equipment, as soon as it's released and you're going to get the current stuff, current product, we want to take advantage of that as soon as possible and let them get really comfortable with it before that first tournament comes. So November through February are really when you want to be set up and done, because then you start the March break camps, and then you're hopefully getting into the season within a month or so once we're back from the March break stuff.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. And I think these are great points, and one that as you say, it reminds me of a scenario that I encounter a lot when we send people to you for fittings. And I think the enthusiasm of a young player as they go to your fitting shop and they kind of see all the toys that you've got and the tools and so on, they're pretty excited to make some changes. But I think it's fair to say that a large percentage of the times that you meet with our players, of course, you're really just telling them that what they have got is excellent, and there's a sort of a self-satisfaction that should be derived, although I'm sure on some level they wish they could get a new club that somehow would miraculously make a ball go further and so on. But the reality is really the goal of a session with a proper club fitter is not to buy the newest best thing necessarily, but rather to leave the facility with a confidence that your equipment fits you well. Back to our analogy, to know that the shoe fits your foot, and I just need to make that clear to our parents here to not. I know of some club fitting places that are really bent on selling the most thousands of dollars possible of equipment to a person, to give what I would call a false confidence that somehow there's a miracle in the high-priced equipment. But the reality is when you're working with an expert club fitter over a long-term period, we really start to see the benefits of club fitting. And this means that often you've got very, very good iron heads for many, many years, and you're just pulling shafts in and out of them over the years to kind of make slight alterations. Again, all with the goal of optimizing equipment, not getting the newest, best thing in someone's hands at all times, particularly in these formative years where things are bound to change soon anyway. We like to think of small incremental investments over time rather than one big investment which you quickly outgrow or becomes outdated. So Jeff, if you don't mind putting on your more techie hat here, can we go through some of the sort of the glossary of terms in the club fitting world and just equip our listeners a little bit more with some of the terminology and some of the concepts that go through a classic club fitting? Maybe we'll start with the irons if possible.
And with what John was speaking about earlier with the 14 clubs, what's allowed in the bag and what's not allowed, a big part of the fitting process is gapping, right? Making sure that you have the proper tools to hit the yardages that you need to hit. As we've seen, very few sets now are of irons specifically. Most sets are now sold as 4-iron. So the hybrids are now part of what we'd consider the iron fitting. So we always want to optimize the driver, of course. Everybody wants to hit the driver as far as they can, and then we work backwards off of there. But with irons, as John pointed out, it may not be a new set of irons that is needed. It may be lie angle adjustments or a length adjustment or a shaft change that's going to help optimize what's going on with the irons. But we want to make sure that the iron head, as you can see in the picture that John has here, I mean, that's obviously a forged blade player's club, which is where most of the industry has gone away from. That is getting into more game improvement irons. But we want to make sure that we have the right level of irons, if you will, and make those tweaks and adjustments and make sure that the gapping's correct. Maybe it's the 5-iron that is actually the longest playable iron when we talk about playable iron, we don't want to be hitting 4-irons as really low darts and not really knowing how far they go and just hoping they get there. So when we refer to the longest playable iron, the example that we use is that you're hitting that iron into a green that has water protecting the front of the green, and it's a front pin. So what is the longest iron that player is comfortable hitting with a proper trajectory and knowing how far it's going to go? So we want to make sure that setup is correct. And maybe it is a 5-iron and we put in 1 or 2 hybrids to help with those, replacing those long. Yeah, lie angle, first and foremost, is very important, even once the fit is optimized, if you will. So I stress to all of these players that you want to check in, if you will, with me once or twice a year. So even the kids or players just fit or fit months ago, at the end of last year, so we know the equipment is still good for them, but now you're hitting tons of balls, particularly indoors off of mats that aren't getting the proper turf interaction. Lie and loft angles can change, particularly on forged irons. So lie angle, as you can see from this image John has, and most of you probably know, it's very simple. It's the relation of the sole of the club to the shaft angle that comes out of the heel of the club. So length, shaft flex, all of these things will impact how that lie angle is interacting with the turf. So we always want to check this with a dynamic fitting. Very common. I've had many people over the years come in and they'd say, I think I need my lie angle adjusted because the toe is up in the air when I sit the club down. Well, in many cases, what I see is that the individual is then bending down and looking at it while they're telling me this, and of course changing that lie angle. But how the club sits doesn't determine how it interacts with a dynamic swing. So we want to check how it's actually interacting with the dynamic swing. And the importance, just a couple of simple stats, that when you're hitting a 5-iron, for example, you're hitting it, let's call it, 180 yards, give or take. If that lie angle is off by 4 degrees, that ball is going to fly about 40 feet left or right of the target. If the lie angle is a right-handed golfer, if the lie angle is 4 degrees up, incorrect, then you're going to be pulling that ball about 20 feet based on how far the ball is traveling and that incorrect lie angle. Even with a wedge, it's still going to be off by about 20 feet. So 40 feet on the longer shot with a 4-degree incorrect lie angle, about 20 feet with a wedge. So you're talking about just a 120-yard shot roughly. You're missing the green, even though you're putting a good swing on that ball. So we want to make sure that lie angle is dialed in, and that's of course related to the length of the club. So with regards to length, if you look at a basic setup of irons, if you just stand them up against the wall by yourself, you'll see there's a half-inch increment from one iron to the next, going down from the 3 or the 4-iron down to the wedge. That is offset by a half a degree of lie angle. So when they manufacture the heads have a 7-gram increment of weight to offset half-inch difference in length to achieve a constant swing weight, and they also have a half-degree difference in lie angle. So if we are, for example, building a set of clubs for the junior that is the clubs themselves are going to be a half-inch short, we then have to adjust the lie angle as well. But by shortening the club naturally, if we take a half-inch off the length, the club is going to naturally flatten by about half a degree. With regards to the shaft flex, depending on how stiff or soft the shaft is, have a what I call a bow factor. So the shaft moves in many different ways throughout the swing. There's a torque factor of the club head twisting the shaft. There's the more obvious of how it bends from the top down through impact. And then what happens also is at the bottom of the swing, the shaft is going to bow down. And that's where we, going back to what I was saying, where people think that if the toe is sitting up a little bit at address, the lie has to be adjusted. Well, depending on the flex of the shaft and the swing speed or the force being exerted upon the shaft, that toe is going to bow down. So we want to see where that shaft is putting that head at impact, where it interacts with the turf. So all of these variables come into play with lie angle. So lie angle doesn't apply as much to drivers in woods. Because we're not drivers, we are hopefully not interacting with turf. The ball's on a tee, so that's not an issue. And with the woods being fairway woods and hybrids, it's not a flat sole as it is on the iron. So if you look at an iron from the toe to the heel, it's more or less flat. It doesn't have that roundness on the bottom of the club that you'll see on fairway woods. So fairway woods, what they do is they incorporate a roundness of the sole so that that heel is not going to catch the same way it will on an iron. Of course, we do have today almost all of the woods, the drivers, fairways, and hybrids are adjustable in the hosel, which is whereas most of you out there that have already seen me, you'll see that I'm a very big proponent of the Titleist product for the woods, because what they do in their fairways and hybrids, and even in their drivers, but more importantly, the fairways and hybrids, their adjustments in the hosel settings are more along the lines of irons, where you can adjust the loft but not sacrifice the face angle. So when you have a driver, a TaylorMade, for example, or some of the other ones where you can remove the shaft and turn it to bump the loft up or down, there is an impact of face angle on that. So and a lot of people don't quite realize that, and even if you do realize, you may say, I have a 10.5 degree driver, but I want to bump it up to a 12 degree. So you pull it out and you turn it. What happens is you're actually closing the face of that club by increasing on it. So yes, we want a higher loft, but we don't necessarily want the face closed, but you can't control that. So with the Titleist woods, and I'm not here to plug Titleist, but from a technical standpoint, I really like the way they've done their setting, where you can adjust the lie of the fairway or hybrid while you're adjusting the loft. But I'm also a very big believer in that if the club is fitted properly, i.e. length and shaft, rarely do we have to use those hosel adjustments. Those hosel adjustments are most often used by players that have it in their own hands, trying to adjust the ball flight because the ball isn't going where they want. So if we go to a driving range and we look at all people standing on the tee hitting drivers, you're going to see that 95% of those drivers are going to be set to draw, because everybody thinks that I can buy a club that's going to draw the golf ball. And those same 95% of players, I would say 85% of them, are still going to be slicing the golf ball. So length, shaft, proper fitting usually negate the need to make those hosel adjustments. But we do also want to keep that in mind, that when we have equipment that does have the adjustments, we want to know all of the side effects that are happening when we change our golf equipment. And it's a pretty simple formula that I tell people, that when they're as simple as changing a grip or nipping the club down a half inch or adding some length to the club, there are always 3 side effects to any change that you make to the physical characteristics of a golf club. And they're not always wrong, but you want to know what they are. So that's a very big part of the fitting process as well, and particularly for the juniors is fantastic because now they're getting this education going forward, and they're very in tune with their equipment. So it's a very nice peace of mind for them to know when the equipment is an issue and when they know that they have an issue. So I always say, either it's a Jeff and John concern or it's a Jeff concern, and they become very in tune with this through the time that I spend with them, in them understanding what we are building for them. And then rather than dad saying, Billy grew a few inches, I think we need new equipment. It's Billy that's better understanding and saying, well, wait a second, Dad, I'm still hitting the ball where I want to hit the ball. I'm hitting it distance-wise. I know exactly what's happening. I don't feel that I need to make a change just yet. So it's very important to be understanding the golf equipment, and if you do go and make a change, not with me personally, which happens quite often. Some people it's not convenient to drop in to change one grip or whatever the case may be. But you have an understanding that if you do put your golf clubs into somebody else's hands, you have a pretty good idea of how they work and what you need.
Now, Jeff, could you speak just quickly to how you've incorporated launch monitors into the woods and driver fittings?
Yeah, launch monitors are key. Absolutely. I mean, everybody now knows that plays this game that if you're going to get fit, you want to have a launch monitor data to show what's happening, whether it's indoors or outdoors. But there's some of the key variables that John has up on the screen here for drivers. Club speed, ball speed, launch angle, attack angle, spin rates. All of these variables and what launch monitors do, and I stress this to people all the time, is that a launch monitor, all it does is give you data. It doesn't give you the answers or the solutions of how to optimize that data. That's where a good club fitter comes in, says, okay, we can all see that these variables are not optimized, but what do we do? How do we get them optimized? So we definitely need to use launch monitors to get the data. What's very important also to keep in mind with launch monitors, because you may use them at driving ranges or in simulators or even at a golf town or whatever the case may be, you also want to be aware of the golf ball that you're using. And that's one of the things that I talk about with people that I fit. And we one of the very common questions that I get is indoor versus outdoor. And there's definitely pros and cons both. Outdoors, you have environmental variables, obviously. The weather conditions are not ideal. The wind is 40 kilometers dead into you, and now you're not hitting your 285-yard drives, you're hitting them 240 yards. And you're also using range balls, which you really have no choice based on being outdoors at a driving range. You're not going to pull out a new golf ball to hit it every time. So when you do look at the spin numbers and flight path on launch monitors, you look at that you're using the golf ball that you would use as well. So this is definitely invaluable information. It's also information that I'll quite often, John and we were talking earlier, it's also information that I'll pass along to the coaching, saying, you know what, this kid that we were just working with, the numbers aren't optimized, but it's not the equipment. Here's it, it's an attack angle, or it's an over the top move, or whatever the case may be, that's more swing related, that has to be addressed to make sure that the equipment is optimized. So we don't want to optimize equipment for a poor swing necessarily, but again, just going back to that launch monitor gives us a lot of information from a club fitting to even a coaching perspective of what's going wrong and the plan of attack to get it optimized.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. It's cool to hear about how the technology can be used for good, and often in our side of the coaching side, we see the abuse of these machines and so on. But clearly, for the club fitting process, it becomes integral, and it's great that you've been able to benefit from that, and that our art's all the more accurate, which is cool. Do you mind, Jeff, if we shift gears a little bit and speak more to the clubs that, as a coach anyway, actually impact scoring as much as any part of the bag, but interestingly are often overlooked, almost like they're some sort of secret cult. The wedges and the putters, and I'm a Titleist guy, and you've already mentioned the Titleist has some neat products in the woods lines and so on. The legend of Scotty Cameron, the legend of Bob Vokey, and the myth that these are two sort of samurai sword builders encamped in their studios, just constantly churning out these beautiful objects. Tell us a little bit about how to fit wedges and putters properly, and when the best time to do this is.
Of all the fittings that I do, rarely do people come for or call for putter fittings or wedge fittings specifically. It's definitely something that needs to be addressed. Again, going back to lie angle, excuse me, the more loft that you have on a golf club, for example, a 56-degree wedge versus a 21-degree 3-iron, the more loft that you have, the more severe the miss will be if the lie angle is off. So obviously the ball's not traveling as far, but wedge lie angle is integral to being able to fire at a pin. And again, this is a dynamic fitting. It's where it's interacting. Left as well. The difference between having a 20-foot putt and a 5-foot putt. Just making sure that you know how far those wedges fly and that you have the proper gapping from one to the next. And this is something that can be tweaked as well. So with wedges in particular, you now have the bounce angle variable. They've been incorporating more bounce into the more recent irons. Again, speaking to Titleist specifically, that's one of the main changes that they've made to the 716 line is they've incorporated a more rounded leading edge or a bounce into the irons, which allows the club to go more easily through the turf, because we are hitting hopefully down on the irons through the turf, and we don't want that club grabbing the turf. We want it going through the turf. So with wedges, again, Vokey, you have the image there, and we're both fans of the Titleist line. If you go to buy wedges and you look at the Vokey line, for example, you have umpteen different options of wedges, and often 3 or 4 options in the same loft. So these are grinds and bounces that really is something that we want to address more closely once we get out in the spring with the players. And this is where we're going to make those fine-tuning adjustments with the lofts and lies and making sure that the bounce is correct. John also has an image there in the middle of grinding. This is something that pros have been doing since the start of the game, where they were the clubs were forged and hand finished for the individual, because they didn't have all of these purchasing options that we have today. They couldn't just choose different bounces and grinds. They would go to a builder or a craftsman that will make those little tweaks on the sole to say, you know what, I want to remove a little bit of edge just towards the heel because I keep just catching it on the turf interaction. That's also something we can do. So we really want to make sure that those wedges are, first and foremost, the loft is giving you the yardage that you need. And the rule of thumb is 4 degrees from, let's say, your pitching wedge to where you, or your gap wedge, where you get into your wedge system. You want to have about 4 degrees off of your pitching wedge. So your pitching wedge could be anywhere from, in today's standards, anywhere from 45 to 48 degrees. So it's very important to know what that number is, to know what your next wedge requirements are, and then to make sure that you have the gaps filled right down to your 58 or what have you. The other thing that I just want to touch on there is going back to that 14 club rule. The rule is not that you have to have 14 clubs. The rule is that you can't have more than 14 clubs. So I don't like to, overload the new player with a toolbox that they don't know how to use. So it's very simple to, or common to sort of leave a bit of a gap because that particular player has never had a 60 degree or has never had that 56 degree, and they don't have the need for it in their game. They're hitting all of their yardages and gaps. So some people are quite comfortable choking down on a pitching wedge or a gap wedge to hit that, call it 56-yard shot. So you don't have to have the 14 clubs. You don't have to have 3 wedges, but we do want to make sure that we have all the yardages covered that the player requires. So we're going to hopefully address that a little more in the spring with the fine tuning of the putters and wedges come tournament time, and make sure everything's dialed in as best as it can be. The long putter no longer being allowed. Lots of things that we being chosen, and the rules, and we're getting very creative stuff available to us to adapt to keeping those putters legal, but making them very easy to use. I mean, the super stroke grip, I'm sure you've all seen that, and most of you probably have them. Counterweighting, counterbalancing, these are all things that there's really no right or wrong. There's definitely some experimentation involved in that. But again, the more in tune the player is with what their miss is, the easier it is for us to find that solution. So you just want to be sure that when you're purchasing the putter, that you're purchasing sort of the right style of head, being it heel shafted, center shafted, mallet style, blade style. You really want to have a good understanding of your stroke and know what type of head design is best suited for your stroke, being a straight back and through, or the barn door as they call it, where you have that outside in typical movement, if you will. There's different amounts of toe hang in the head. There's all kinds of options out there. There's no right answer that Jeff can give you without you really being able to, or we being able to identify what the stroke type is and what your miss is. Are you constantly missing short or missing left or missing right? Again, that goes back to the education process of the player becoming very in tune with what's going on and knowing if it's equipment or not equipment. Kinds of stuff that we can do with players. And it's lots of fun to try new things, because sometimes it's as simple as a grip change that makes a world of difference.
Yeah, well, just great stuff there, Jeff, and it's it's interesting that the putters don't get as much love in the fitting world or in the interest of the consumer. Obviously, when they're such an integral part of the bag, but great to hear that we'll be working on some putter fittings this year and in the future and so on. So that's all cool. And I just wanted to make a point of sort of acknowledging your perspective on club fitting and club repair, which is nice and kind of refreshing, and certainly aligns itself well with our ideologies here at Golf Performance Coaches. It's been nice to hear you suggest that the goal here, and particularly with growing athletes, is never that we're trying to nail it dead on the head. There's going to be some mythical perfect fit that all of a sudden miraculously the players play to their potential at all times, and nor should we live in a fear that if we don't get the perfect fit, we're destined to play poorly for the rest of our lives and so on. At the end of the day, really what we're doing is circling around the best possible fit at any stage of development. We're not trying to get something right so much as we're trying to get it nearly right. And isn't that so much like the sport that we love to play? And it's kind of neat to hear you talk like that, and it's refreshing because many in your line of work and so on are, and if you look at a magazine or a Golf Channel ad or what have you, there's this false promise that there's some perfect fit or perfect club that's going to miraculously change everything for you. But really what we're trying to do is attack this problem of optimizing equipment with logic and expertise. And if you approach any discipline that you're trying to improve with logic and expertise, you have a very, very good chance of improving and living to your potential more often. But anyway, Jeff, so thanks for doing that. It's nice to hear. Do you have some suggestions on the maintenance of equipment? And there's lots of keen players listening in on this and so on. And so what are some of the classic rituals that players should be doing to kind of maintain their investment, as it were?
Them a little bit.
Yep, absolutely. And in your slide that you have here, I mean, those 4 bullets there basically sum it up. Absolutely, if you want your grooves on your golf clubs to work, they can't be caked with dirt and mud. As far as groove cleaning, the most important and simplest thing is just to do it regularly. A lot of guys now carrying the towels on their bag, and it's very simple. Just carry a towel on your bag, wet a portion of it before the round, and every time you hit a shot, just give it a wipe before you put it back in the bag. And with being as simple as that, that should never happen with the caking. They also have obviously these groove cleaning tools, the ones that have the soft bristle and the brass bristle on the other. Absolutely, it's not going to damage your iron. I mean, they wouldn't. That company wouldn't keep producing those things if they were ruining the clubs. I certainly wouldn't use them on the top of your driver, obviously, but when you do get that, particularly on wedges, where you get that little extra that's not coming off of the towel, just get a brush and just give it a little scrub. Grips, soap and water. I would say, once a month, whatever the case may be. Lots of wool grips on the market nowadays. Very common. People will look at the white grips and say to me, yeah, but they're going to get dirty. They are going to get equally dirty as your black grips. The difference is that you're going to see the dirt. On the black grips, you don't see them. So if you want these tools to perform optimally, then obviously the simple maintenance of cleaning them is very important. And if you do it regularly, you're not going to have that issue where you have to sit down and really scrub things out.